Well, aloha everyone, and welcome back to Chaminade University here at our People and Nature course. Today we'll be discussing Unit 7, which talks about plant domestication. So I'm going to introduce a brief history of early agriculture before we move forward. So before agriculture, humans were hunter-gatherers. They basically ate whatever they could find, and they traveled around to be able to find things when they were in season. This included about approximately 60 to 80% of plant-based diet, including things like rice, millets, oats, grasses, roots, things like tubers, right, nuts, and wild fruits. While they did have oil in their diet, most of the oil came from animal sources, but some of it did come from plants, and some of these oils we still use today, right? Coconut oil, palm oil, shea butter, olive oil. You recognize all of these in our current diet. And one of the things that our ancestors had to figure out was which plants were toxic. And so that was one of the things that ended up being passed on through generation to generation, was something that you learned from your ancestors, what you were able to eat when it came into season, where you had to travel to get it, etc. And there are still some nomadic lifestyles on this planet today. But then eventually agriculture kind of came about, and there were a lot of questions as to how it came about. Many lines of thought were tossed about, including perhaps agriculture was a gift handed down from the gods, or the idea of propinquity theory, which basically means that there were just too many people, and so they eventually had to settle. They couldn't just migrate everywhere. Another pretty reasonable idea is something called invention and discovery, which basically meant that there were garbage dumps on the outside of cities, right? You wouldn't take your waste super far. You might not dump it next to your house, but eventually the cities started making these garbage dump areas, and then these dump areas would end up sprouting vegetables, and eventually what would happen is you'd go back to the place where you dumped your food, several months ago, and you'd be able to harvest, and that led people to understand the idea of seeds and being able to plant and water and nurture and care for, which eventually led to agriculture. And what did agriculture spring about, right? About 10,000 years ago, just after the Ice Age. And it was actually invented in a lot of different locations on the planet at the same time, or at least within a very short period of time, including Mesopotamia, Africa, and China. They did grow different crops, though, so you'll note that the list of crops from Mesopotamia are a little bit different than those from Africa and those from China. But you will know that a lot of them have different sets of something similar to like a rice that would be a grain, or they also have peas, things that are going to have proteins and a lot of the same amino acids that are going to be in there. So they're all going to end up providing a well-balanced diet, which is interesting. You also see a lot of different fruits, right? Might not have the same fruits, but you would end up getting fruit sugars from whatever grew nearby that then you would cultivate. Approximately the same time, we ended up cultivating agriculture in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, also in the New World and South America. And the New World referring to like Mexico and Central America. And again, we have several different sets of fruits and different grains, etc., tubers, but they are all meeting a lot of the same food groups, which is kind of interesting that they all end up with rounded diets. Very few of these crops actually started off in the United States. So most of the food crops that came to the United States originate from other regions. Generally, the crops came from Mesoamerica, which is a whole different story, but it indicates that American Indians actually had trade with Central and South America. And some of the crops that are native to America include things like grapes, plums, pecans, chestnuts, hickory nuts, etc. Lots of nuts are things that were grown in the Native American Indians agriculture. So how did agriculture come about? Right? And basically what happens is that we end up with vegetatively propagated plants. What does that mean? Plants that can be cloned, plants that we can take a bit of and hand it to our neighbor, and then our neighbor can care of, and then it will grow more, and they can pass it to their neighbor. So eventually everyone can have their own mini gardens in their backyard. So anything that's easily propagated, that's going to be able to be multiplied very quickly. And additionally, they had other vegetative crops, things like sugarcane, which is highly coveted, right? Sweets, very nice. Pineapples as well, though, and potatoes, sweet potatoes, bananas, and dates. So these are all crops that they were able to cultivate fairly easily and then end up turning into agricultural products that they were able to share, which led to the ability for the town or village to become more settled, right? And how did agriculture begin? Another way that it began was propagation by seed. So not just propagation by cloning, but being able to store your seeds from one year to the next. And you also are able to select, oh, this plant gave me a really strong crop of corn, a really large bed of corn, had more kernels than the other corn, or whatever plant you're talking about, but you're able to select for whatever traits you like. So therefore then you can keep the seeds from the ones that you like to get a yield that have higher yield or more sweet or whatever. And so you could favor different types of plants. So you're going to see the word non-shattering quite a lot. And if you look at a seed in the wild is meant to hit the ground, break open, and allow for that seed to grow into the plant. But if you're trying to cultivate and use that seed for storage, we as humankind don't want the shattering seeds, because then you lose the inside of it, which is what you want. So we want to be able to take them, collect them as a whole, and then be able to shatter them on our own. Additionally, we don't want the seeds to fall off of the plant. So if you picture something like a sunflower, right, all of those sunflower seeds actually stay in the head of the plants, and we've selected for that so that we could end up harvesting the whole thing and then take it somewhere to be able to get the seeds off of it. So it's going to increase your yield. So we'll have favorable characteristics that we look for in plants, including how vigorous they are, whether they have larger or smaller seeds, whether or not they have larger or smaller fruits, etc. And once a plant becomes truly domesticated, which is a process, right? It kind of happens stage by stage by stage. But once it becomes truly domesticated, plants are unable to survive without humans to grow them because they've actually been selected against traits that would allow them to survive in the wilds. And so in this manner, they actually have to grow hand in hand with the humans because humans are going to get the benefit of having the food source and all the traits that they like, and the plants are going to get the benefit of propagation to the next generation. So they're going to be able to survive and reproduce, which realistically is the whole point of evolutionary theory, right? So all of these factors together resulted in the invention of agriculture, which was basically the shift to plant domestication. That included a better health because you were able to have food sources that were available to you, had a longer lifespan because you didn't have to live a nomadic lifestyle and perhaps face hunger and food shortages. It also allowed for an easier overall lifestyle, which allowed for cultural development. So this is actually very interesting and is going to be a different side note, but it allows for things like art and history and dance and music to develop because people are able to specialize in other things besides getting food and then trade those skills for the food that are collected by people who gather it or grow it. And so to keep it in perspective, humans were hunters and gatherers for 30,000 plus years. And yet we've only been farming for about 10,000 years, which is approximately of 400 generations. So for about one quarter of the time that humans have been considered to be humans, we've been actually using plants to our advantage. Now, what are the impacts of domestication? So what is it that we are looking for? What's desirable? So we want to have the most yield. That means whatever it is that we have desire about the plant, we want to end up with more and more of that. We also want to have non-shattering seeds. Again, that makes it easier for them to harvest. The larger seeds are going to be easier for us to eat as well, especially if we have to peel the outside off. Additionally, we're looking for lower toxic substances, less bitter tastes, etc., which means that over time these plants become more and more and more tame, which means they're more susceptible to being eaten in the wild, right? Those toxins were actually there to prevent them from being eaten, but since we're propagating them, it's going to end up being passed on into the next generations. Also, additionally, we're looking for increased protein content, oil content, sugar concentration, things that are going to taste better. We might not be looking for them necessarily in a cognitive way, but you know that this one tastes better than that one, so we choose the sweet corn over the other corn, and then we propagate those over time, getting sweeter and sweeter yields. So this is called selective breeding. And basically what you do is you choose the plant that gives you the characteristics that you want, and you breed it with either itself or a sibling that also has the characteristics that you want, and eventually you end up getting plants that have all of the characteristics that you want, right, by wielding out the ones that you don't. Now, what are the major food crops of the world? You may recognize most of these. I'm not going to read them out loud to you, but these are the 30 major food crops, and a lot of these are things that you would recognize pretty much instantly: rice, potato, corn, sweet potato, grapes, right? But then there's a couple things on there that I'm not actually really even sure what they are, like millets, for example, and some other oils that I don't even consider to be, like, I've never consumed cottonseed oil that I know of, right? Whereas we would consider things like soybean oil or corn oil to be the oils that we would be consuming. So, all right, so what types of crops are there? So all the crops are going to fall into major food categories. We have grain crops. Those include things like wheat, rice, corn, etc. Oil crops, things that are going to be pressed to be able to provide oil. We can use these oil for several different things, for cooking, for storage, etc. Also in tools, in trade. So we use it for lamps, for example. So olive oil, linseed oil, sesame oil, sunflower oil, soybean oil, coconut oil, palm oil, corn oil. You recognize most of these oils. We also have crops that we grow for fiber, things like cotton, flax, etc. And these are all plants that we would be using to perhaps make clothing, etc., or make baskets that you carry things in. Also forage crops, so these are crops that are going to basically be ground cover, things like alfalfa, clovers, legumes, and grasses. And these we're probably going to be using for things like sprouts, right? You wouldn't necessarily eat it as you wouldn't eat alfalfa by itself, but alfalfa sprouts you would eat. So you generally, this is where we're going to be getting a lot of the high nutrients and vitamins that are in those original seeds that then just sprout above the ground for just a little bit, and then we can eat them that way. Additionally, we have some crops that we like because we like the way they taste or we like the way they feel. Spice crops, drug crops, right? Things like tobacco, black pepper, cinnamon. You can think of a ton of different spices, and also different types of drugs that people have used or grown over the years and cultivated. Additionally, fruit crops, vegetable crops, ornamental crops, things that you're not necessarily going to consume but you think are pretty, and trees, which are going to help in a lot of different ways but aren't necessarily going to be consumed. All right, so let's talk about the process of crop domestication, right? So crop domestication, again, happened a lot of places at basically the same time. And the idea of how it happened was first devised in 1919, and it was based on archaeological evidence that they discovered at the time in multiple different locations. And basically what happened is that hunter-gatherers transitioned into cultivation of food products in 24 different regions in a very short window of time. So we're not necessarily sure if word got out or if everyone just kind of came across the same idea because the planet was getting to the point where we had more and more people, and so they had to settle down. But in 24 different regions on the planet at approximately the same century, we ended up with domestication of plants. What is domestication? So basically, domestication involves a genetic bottleneck. So what is that? Basically, a bottleneck is when, if you were to consider that these are all different genes, and these are the original wild species, and there's a lot of variability in the wild, right? We have tons of different crops to choose from out in the wild, different food sources. Some of them we don't like; they're too bitter. Some of them we don't like; they have too small fruits, so you end up having to eat too many of them, and it takes too long. Some of them we don't like because you have to dig for them, or etc. So there's reasons why we don't like different plants. And so we would select the ones that we do like and eliminate, for example, all the yellow ones are bitter, right? So we eliminate those in the early domesticated ones. And then eventually we select from the ones that we've domesticated for larger fruits or sweeter product or more corn so higher yield of whatever it is you're looking for. And eventually you end up with what gets closer and closer to a monoculture. And a monoculture is that we have all the same particular plant in the entire field of the crop. And so a genetic bottleneck is basically a way by which certain genes are eliminated from the population of plants that you're going to be choosing for the next generation and eventually end up being weeded out entirely. And that also can kind of look similar to this. Here's our wild progenitor, right? If we have a gene that is not selected for or against, it can end up being it might make it through, it might not make it through. But we have a gene that is selected for example, we really like this here. It gives us a sweeter corn or larger kernels or more kernels per cob or something like that. Then that is going to end up being what ends up showing up in the domesticate, right? So as you select over time, you end up having, you as the farmer are inducing selective pressure on the crops to be able to pick the genes that go into the next generation. And very few genes are selected for, but they can account for large shifts in the phenotype because you are selecting for sweetness or for oil or whatnot. And while people think that domestication is something that it's basically either domesticated or not domesticated, there's actually a large transition. So here's the wild plant, and it's going to go through certain levels and then maybe become larger fruits and then end up having non-shattering seeds or whatever it is, and those traits are going to get selected for over and over to eventually we end up with a domesticated plant. And in order for a plant to be considered domesticated, it has to be unable to survive in the wild on its own, right? And there's several different stages of domestication. So the distinction of being domesticated or not domesticated oversimplifies the question. Some crops are going to be more domesticated than others, of course, right? And we recognize different levels of domestication. So again, completely wild versus some level of domestication versus entirely domesticated. But how do we decide which level, right? And one of the major things that decide that this plant is domesticated is non-shattering. As I mentioned, plant species that are domesticated are entirely dependent on humans for survival and propagation. And when a plant gets to the point where the seeds are non-shattering, that means that those seeds, if they're put directly in the ground, are very unlikely to anyway, actually grow because it has to get through that outer shell, and if that shell won't shatter on its own, then it's never going to be able to grow. And that means that the only way that this plant is able to be propagated is if humans shatter the seeds for it and put it into the next generation. So basically any trait that means that the plants aren't able to survive and reproduce on their own is going to put them in the domesticated category. Right. So, what are some of the traits of domesticated plants? And these are traits that, again, are probably going to be traits or were traits that were selected for by early man. So, a domesticated syndrome is basically anything that describes one part of the crop that's going to differentiate it from its wild progenitor, like we just mentioned with the non-shattering seeds. Some of these characteristics include things like large fruits and grains, more robust or hardier plants. So you can see why you would want to select for these, right? You want to end up with more bang for your buck. You want to end up with more fruit or more grain for the amount of water or effort that you put in so that you can tend to less plants, right? You want more robust plants so that if you were losing 20% of them throughout the season and then next season you only lost 10% of them, well, now you end up with a better yield, right? So you want the stronger plants. You want plants that have better growth, increased apical dominance. That means it has a better chance of getting more sunlight, etc. All of the things are going to be towards the end of the plant. Um, and some of the other characteristics that we'll talk about is that loss of natural seed dispersal. So the seeds staying on the head of that sunflower, for example. And generally, fewer fruits or grains is going to be a trade-off for larger fruits or grains, right? So the larger the fruits, the less of them that you're going to get, but they're going to be a higher yield and easier to pick one than to pick 20, right? So humans are selecting for things that make it easier in their lifestyle and also for things that taste better, right? Decrease in the substances that are bitter to their tongue, increase in the substances that humans find edible, right? So in the structures that humans find edible, or changes in photoperiod sensitivity, which seems like it's not that big of a deal, but if you want to make sure that this crop is going to do well in multiple parts of the country, then it's going to have to be um, able to change its sensitivity to sunlight depending on where it is. And also, we want these plants to survive for longer growing seasons. So if we can end up with a little bit more flexibility in when they're able to continue to thrive, then we can end up with seasons that are a little bit longer, which again is going to reduce or result in better yield for the human. So these are some examples of domestication syndrome. So a tomato, this is the wild tomato on the left, and although those are going to get red, they're never going to get huge. And then instead of having 10 or however many of these smaller ones, you end up with one much larger fruit. So that's a domesticated tomato. Sunflowers, for example, here's their wild progenitor, and here they are today. There's many different types of sunflowers, of course, but one of the characteristics is that the sunflowers are going to have an increased seed size and increased amount of seeds per head. So instead of having 20 here, they have 200 there. And I know those numbers aren't off. My point is they've got less heads, but they have increased seeds per head, and there's reduced branching. So we have less flowers. We only have one flower, but all of them are here. So we're able to just pluck this one flower instead of having to pluck 20 to be able to get the seeds. Plus we have larger seeds, which is important because inside is what we're looking for. So we only have to shatter one instead of having to shatter 5 or whatnot to get the same amount of seed biomass. Right. Additionally, these seeds are not going to fall off of this head, which means we can take this whole thing much later on instead of missing our window where it might have broken open and dispersed the seeds on its own. So it's not going to have its own auto seed dispersal. Wheat is a pretty classic example of the reduced seeds shattering. So the seeds are going to end up being stronger and increase in size. So we're going to have to separate them out ourselves, but they're also going to end up staying on these ears for a little bit longer. So they end up with being able to be harvested kind of all together instead of falling off of the stalk. Lettuce is a pretty good example of fewer bitter compounds. So the original sets of lettuce, first of all, they're much longer shapes, so that's going to have to cut more to get a better yield as opposed to something that looks like this, so a different shape and size of the leaf. But additionally, it's lost the bitter compounds and the bitter taste, so iceberg lettuce is going to have a nice sweet taste to it instead of any of the bitter compounds. Rice, same thing, no shattering and larger grains. So pretty much classic for the grain family is to get larger and larger and to reduce the seed shattering. And last but not least, corn, which is the classic example. Corn hits every single one of our targets. It's got a reduced fruit case, right? So it's going to have softer gloom, increased kernels per cob, so they get much larger, right? No dispersal, so these are not going to disperse on their own. If you were to leave that corn cob on the ground, the kernels would not be able to get into the soil because they would be stuck inside the cob. So it's up to humans to make sure that they get those seeds free and be able to plant those seeds. So the crops actually rely on the humans. And then, of course, increased apical dominance. And again, the domestication of maize is the classic example of selective breeding, right? Here's the original maize. This is much smaller, very small seeds, etc. Over time, we've selected for much larger. Right, here's our same coin, more kernels per, and they're going to end up with less of them that are closer to the stalk, right? So less of them that are going to be much more easy to pick one off, and so you're going to get a lot more yield or bang for your buck for your energy, right? So I'm going to talk about transgenic plants for a second because we just talked about selective breeding, and selective breeding is basically genetic alterations based on what you're looking for in a phenotype or an outward appearance of the plant, right? If you're looking for something that is sweeter, something that is larger, etc., you're basically picking the ones that have those traits, breeding them in hopes of enhancing those traits over time, like we just talked about with corn and all the rest of those plants. But transgenic plants can kind of bypass that. So it's been genetically manipulated. It's a plant that you decide that you want, whatever your syndrome, your domesticated syndrome to be, without having to go through 100,000 crosses to get larger and larger and larger, or sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. So a plant can be domesticated in a lab, saving centuries of selective breeding efforts. Now, there's controversy over the transgenics. We do have several advantages. First, you can improve that phenotype very quickly. You can do it over just a couple generations, and you can address whatever it is that you like / whatever it is that you don't like. It also increases the yield of the plant and can increase the nutritional benefits, as we're going to talk about in just a second. We'll talk about some examples where we have increased the nutritional benefits, for example, golden rice, or we can increase the yield of, for example, the papaya that were previously being plagued by a virus. So we'll talk about those in a second. Additionally, we can put in certain genes that allow for the reduction of herbicide use, pesticide use, fertilizer use, so you can make it that these plants are going to be very frugal in what they are using, and they can therefore end up saving on all of the chemicals, which are both costly and, of course, impact the environment. Some of the disadvantages, however, include the fact that there's very little regulation, and at this point the biotech companies can pretty much do what they want, and Monsanto is a pretty good example of that. I'm sure if you're here in Hawaii, you're familiar with some of the backlash that Monsanto has gotten recently. Additionally, it induces a monoculture. Of course, so does selective breeding. So regular cornfields do this too, but it ends up with a loss of genetic diversity. So you end up with all of the exact same plant, which leaves the plant and the entire population of plants vulnerable to whatever disease may come through. If one of the plants is going to be susceptible, they all are, because they all have the same genetics. But I'm going to get away from the whole just say no to GMO and Frankenfoods argument, which I'm sure you have heard from many people in the past. And I want to talk about some positives of genetically modified foods, some transgenic heroes, if you will. The first one I'm going to talk about are genetically engineered papayas. And if you're eating papayas here in Hawaii, you are eating GE papayas. How do I know? Because a little while ago, there was a blight. It was called the papaya ring spot virus, or the PRSV. It was a major disease of papaya, and because it affected most papaya species, and it wasn't limited to one species or another, it had a lot of opportunity to infect one crop to another, one farm to another, etc. So if farms placed crops near to each other, or if farms were placed near to one another, it could go through and wipe out entire sections. And this is what it looks like. So here's the ring spot virus on the papaya fruit, and eventually it does make the fruit inedible and rots away before it can make it to market, which obviously causes a problem both financially and also in terms of a food scarcity. So let me back up a little bit. So papayas were originally grown on the island of Oahu. However, in the 50s, the virus hit the crops, and so they took the crops that they knew hadn't been hit yet, and they moved them to a whole different island because they just were unable to stop the spread. So they relocated to Puna, which is on Big Island, and then later on, they actually found the virus again in Hilo, also on Big Island, in the 1970s. And so this prompted them to investigate the way that they could fight this blight by creating a genetically engineered papaya. And so those studies started in 1985, and again, this is because we had a huge reliance on the papaya product, both as a food source and also as an economic staple of the community. So from 1985 to 1991, they worked on this project, and they eventually developed a transgenic papaya that was resistant to PRSV because, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically it contained a gene inside of it that was originally from the virus itself, involved in the protein coat of the virus. And that protected the papayas from damage because the PRSV couldn't actually get into the cells themselves. And just to kind of throw some numbers at you, the year that gave the largest yield of papaya in Hawaii was 1984, and that year they yielded 80 million pounds. In 1992, the virus hit again. Again, this is Puna on the Big Island, and production levels were approximately 53 million pounds, which was just 65% of where we were in 1984. Now that GE papaya that they created wasn't available commercially, so it had to go through testing, et cetera, to make sure it was safe. It was one of the very first genetically engineered plants, and so they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just going to run rampant in the wild, for example, or have some sort of unknown side effects. So they took a while to get it to market, so it wasn't available until 1998. And by 1998, papaya production was cut down to 26 million pounds. So in half from where we were when we originally had the blight in 92, well, not the original blight, but the blight in Pune that came out in 92, and a third of our peak capacity of 1984. And now in 2010, which mind you, we just went forward 20 years almost, right? 98. So I guess, all right, we went forward 10 years, 12 years. By 12 years, they had an increase to 30 million pounds. Now, that's not a very large increase. It's actually kind of a slight increase, but the papaya yield is mainly from the GE papaya. And unfortunately, if we keep that increase in rate of repair, it would take approximately 144 years to get back to 80 million pounds of papaya, which again is where we were in 1984. So we'll see again in 2164 when that industry rebounds. But I know that sounds kind of gloom and doom, but realistically what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that the yields are increasing and that the industry and all of the members of the industry are going to continue on. And that's really important. What I'm saying here is that transgenic plants actually saved the papaya industry. So that's an example of a transgenic hero. Another example is golden rice, is the classically yielded example. And so golden rice has a precursor to vitamin A in it. So I'm going to start talking about vitamin A deficiency and why it's important that we actually get golden rice to the global population. And so LADC means less economically developed countries. This basically means countries that are going to be second and third world nations. And in these nations, approximately 1/3 of the children under age 5 are affected by vitamin A deficiency. And it's also the leading cause of childhood blindness in the entire world. And again, that's also mainly in these underdeveloped countries. Vitamin A is really important. It's important in immune system function, and if you end up with a deficiency, you're more likely to get sick, things like measles, etc., and respiratory diseases, diarrheal diseases, etc. So vitamin A is very important in maintaining your immune system, and we've known this for a long time. We've used vitamin A supplements for many decades, and that's saved approximately 600,000 lives per year, and again, these low and middle income countries. It doesn't really affect first world nations because we generally get vitamin A in our diets. However, these efforts aren't enough to be able to eliminate the deficiency, and plus they're costly and logistically complicated. You have to be able to get these vitamins to these individuals that are suffering from malnutrition. But golden rice is a fantastic idea to get around these problems because it's able to be passed on from one generation to the next, right? That once they start to grow it, they're able to have that as their food source. So it is going to be able to combat malnutrition by supplementing it something that's missing from their diet and something that they eat as a primary food staple, rice. And so it's basically rice that's been genetically engineered to contain beta carotene, which is the precursor to vitamin A. And it's a really great classic example demonstrating how we're able to improve global nutrition through modification of the food staples. So golden rice costs approximately the same amount to grow as regular rice, and it's called golden rice because it has a golden-like hue. Remember, vitamin A is found in carrots. That's why they always tell you that you eat your carrots so you don't go blind. And so it's going to have kind of a golden orange hue to it. And it was field tested over a decade ago, and since then it's become a staple crop in many less economically developed countries in the world. And so it's not the only biofortified staple. In fact, there are many other biofortified staple crops that are in development that search for increasing certain traits that are often associated with malnutrition, like a lack of, as we mentioned, vitamin A, so precursors, beta carotene, a lack of vitamin E, vitamin C, iron, essential amino acids, which are going to be what you take and create proteins from, and also a high protein content and quality protein content and fiber. So all of these are things that they are trying to increase the yield in these certain traits, or of these certain traits, in these particular crops. So basically the crops are designed to supply micronutrients that are missing in the diet of people who are malnourished in these third world and impoverished nations, including things like vitamin E in the corn, as well as increased iron availability in rice and in corn. And they also look at protein content. So one of the major malnutrition issues in poorer countries, affecting almost a quarter of the children, is a protein energy malnutrition, and that actually leads to lethargy and can lead to muscle loss, etc. And because a lot of the staple crops that they eat have low levels of essential amino acids, so while you are getting amino acids, you're not getting enough of the right ones. And so we can go through the process of giving these micronutrients to these plants so that people who are in these underdeveloped nations are able to ingest these nutrients that they need from food sources that they have readily available. So just to summarize what I've told you today, the process of plant domestication is a symbiotic relationship, and it's going to benefit both the plant because the plant is being chosen for propagation, and that ensures the survival and reproduction of its species, and also the humans who no longer have to forage for food and are able to select for the traits that they like. And although that selection has happened for centuries via what we call selective breeding, again, the example we gave you with maize going to corn, but the new era of genetic modification allows us to accelerate this process very quickly, and we do need to obviously be cautious with how we use this power, but it has great impact on third world and developing nations because we can now address the problem of malnutrition by basically putting the vitamin into your grain of rice. Thank you so very much for paying attention to me today. Aloha and happy studying.